There are times when life seems too much to be faced with sobriety. And sometimes, what begins as a simple distraction, a glass of wine at the end of the day, an endless rollover on the cell phone, an extra tablet, turns into a prison. But no one chooses to get lost. No one dreams of becoming dependent. Addiction is not a moral error. It is a desperate request for help. A suffocated cry behind a routine that looks functional, behind a body, apparently. Carl Jung said that no one becomes illuminated by imagining figures of light, but making darkness conscious. And that is exactly what addiction is. An attempt to hide this darkness, to stifle a pain that has no name. In this video, we will enter the mind of an addict, not to judge, but to understand. Let's find out why addiction is not just a search for pleasure, but a shortcut to avoid suffering. Let's explore what Jung called the great imbalance of the soul, and what Gabor is defined as the desperate attempt to cure an unrecognized emotional wound. If you have already felt stuck in a cycle that cannot break, or know someone who lives like this video is for you. Because addiction does not start with a substance, it starts with a void. And understanding this emptiness can be the first step to break free. Carl Jung was one of the first to address addiction not as a moral problem, but as a psychic symptom. For him, addiction is the unconscious attempt to escape an inner confrontation, a sign that something within the soul is out of balance. Jung believed that behind compulsive behavior, there is always a pain not faced, an existential void, a trauma hidden in the unconscious. The addict, for Jung, does not seek pleasure for the substance itself. He seeks an altered state because the present state has become unbearable. In Jung's words, every addiction is an attempt not only to escape pain, but to find God. This statement, as provocative as deep, shows that the addict is looking for transcendence, of a greater meaning to support his own existence. But when the soul is fragmented, when the individual cannot reconnect with his own inner symbols, he seeks outside what has lost inside. The addiction then becomes a ritual. The substance or repetitive behavior becomes a modern totem, a false spirituality that temporarily relieves but charges dearly. For Jung, healing begins when the individual looks at this pain without fear. When you understand that addiction is not the enemy but the messenger, a sign that something deeper is asking to be seen, accepted, and transformed. For the physician and author Gabor Maté, no addiction exists without pain. He clearly states, the question is not why addiction, but why pain. Maté has worked for decades with homeless people, heavy drug users, and found an alarming pattern. Virtually everyone had a trauma history. Abuse, neglect, emotional abandonment, deep wounds that have never been healed. Addiction, in this sense, is an anesthetic. It is a desperate attempt to silence internal screams that have never been heard. And this goes for any kind of addiction, from heroin to social networks. The substance or behavior is only the surface. What is underneath is always the pain. In his book, The Kingdom of Hungry Ghosts, which describes how the addict's brain changes, traumatic experiences during childhood directly affect the development of dopamine circuits, emotional self-regulation, and the sense of connection with the world. Result, a more prone adult to impulsiveness, chronic anxiety, and a feeling of emptiness that never seems to end. Maté also explains that modern society makes it worse. We live in a system that rewards productivity and despises vulnerability. A system that idolizes consumption and ignores emotional care. In this environment, addiction becomes an adaptive response. Wrong, but understandable. Therefore, for Maté, the treatment of addiction cannot only be focused on stopping. It is necessary to cure the original pain, and that requires empathy, listen, and above all, emotional security. Without it, the cycle continues, because what keeps addiction is not the substance, it is the pain it tries to hide. Carl Jung saw addiction not only as a clinical or social problem, but as a symbolic phenomenon of the soul. For him, the addiction is a manifestation of what was repressed, what was thrown in the shadows of our psyche. The shadow, according to Jung, is all we deny ourselves. Desires, impulses, emotions, personality traits that do not fit the ideal image we want to project. But what is repressed does not disappear. He moves, assumes other forms, and one of these forms is addiction. For Jung, the substance, alcohol, the drug, the sex, the cell phone, becomes a symbolic substitute for what was lost, the connection with oneself, the totality. Therefore, he said that all addiction is a substitute attempt at transcendence. The addict, in his most intimate background, does not seek the substance in himself, seeks a spiritual experience. It seeks a meaning, a fusion, a state of inner union, something that rescues the fragmentation from inner chaos. But by seeking this by destructive means, the person moves further from himself. Jung also associated addiction to the loss of consciousness. When behavior becomes compulsive, it is controlled by the unconscious. The person no longer chooses, he is chosen. This is why he claimed that the first step for any transformation is to make the unconscious conscious. Or in his words, until you become aware of the unconscious, he will direct your life and you will call you destination. So the cure of addiction for Jung is not just stopping, it is integrating. It is redeeming denied parts of the self. It is illuminating the shadow. And only when the person sees facing what he tried to avoid for years did the possibility of healing begin. For raw material, doctor and author renowned in the study of addictions, addiction is never the real problem. It is the answer, the response to deep emotional pain, often rooted in childhood trauma, emotional neglect, or relationships marked by absence. The fundamental question that material proposes to us is not why addiction, but why pain. He notes that virtually all the addicted patients with whom he worked had stories of unused suffering. Abandon, physical or psychological abuse, cold homes, absent or emotionally unavailable parents. And, even in cases where there is no evident trauma, Maté shows how a childhood without true affection is enough to silently hurt emotional development. This accumulated pain becomes an invisible wound that time does not heal, but that the individual tries to anesthetize. Compulsive substance or behavior becomes a crutch, not for pleasure but to avoid suffering. Material is straightforward. Addiction is not a moral choice. It is an adaptation. It is a desperate attempt to escape an unbearable state of being. This vision breaks with the common sense that he sees the addict as a weak or without willpower. On the contrary, it is often someone who has resisted too much, alone, too long. Addiction then comes as a relief request. And here is a crucial point. If addiction is an adaptation to trauma, combating it with repression and punishment is to reinforce the original trauma. Cure, in this case, requires not only abstinence, requires compassion, listening, welcoming. Gabor Maté proposes a deeply human approach, not treating addiction as a crime or moral failure, but as a symptom of something much broader, a society that denies affection, excludes the different, and rewards only performance. If pain is the seed of addiction, the soil in which it grows is spiritual emptiness. Gabor Maté points to a silent but devastating phenomenon. We live in a culture that stimulates consumption as a substitute for meaning. Since childhood, we are bombarded with the idea that happiness is in possessing. Buy, conquer, accumulate. But this promise is a mirage. The more we look outside, the more we feel the emptiness inside. This spiritual black hole, as Maté describes, is the space left by fragile human connections, fragmented values, and the loss of existential meaning. Instead of looking inside, we learn to distract ourselves. Social networks, alcohol, pornography, shopping, work. Everything becomes exhaust valve. The addict is just the one who took it to the extreme. But in a way, we all participate in this logic. We use consumption as anesthesia, not to face our own loneliness, our lack of direction, our hunger for belonging. This topic is uncomfortable because it doesn't just talk about others, speaks of us. It shows that modern culture, in its search for immediate efficiency and gratification, creates a fertile environment for addictions. Therefore, overcoming addiction requires more than individual treatment. It requires a critique of the culture that produces it. Returning the meaning of life is not a journey out. It is a return to what was abandoned: silence, connection, presence, and purpose. All addiction is, first of all, an attempt to deal with pain, a pain that often has deep roots in childhood. Gabor Maté is directly in stating, the question is not why addiction, but why pain. Many who fight against dependencies did not start seeking pleasure. They started trying to survive emotionally. Abusive homes, negligence, emotionally absent parents, all of this leaves invisible but profound marks on brain formation and identity. Jung already said that unique wounds of childhood manifest themselves in adulthood in the form of neuroses, compulsions, disorders, or addictions. And you don't have to live explicit abuses to carry trauma. The emotional absence, non-recognition, the constant feeling of not being enough, all this shapes the way we feel and relate to the world. Addiction, in this sense, is not the problem itself, but the solution that the mind has found to continue working. An emotional anesthesia mechanism. Alcohol, the drug, pornography, the game are desperate attempts to fill what was missing: connection, security, love. And so, fighting addiction, without looking at the pain that originated it, is how to prune the leaves of a tree without touching its roots. The real healing process begins when we stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and we started asking, "What happened to me?" This change of perspective is powerful. She takes us out of guilt and puts us on the way to compassion, and it is from this point that the actual transformation can begin. Often, addiction does not start with a big fall, but with small concessions. One slide, an escape, something that seemed harmless. But without realizing it, the person enters a repetition cycle, a pattern that neurologically reinforces each return to vicious behavior. And the most dangerous of all this is that this cycle disguises themselves as relief. It is pleasant at first. The mind believes it is finding a solution, but it is actually digging an increasingly deep hole. This is the paradox of self-sabotage. The very attempt to protect itself from pain becomes a new kind of suffering. Gabor Maté explains that over time, the brain adapts to additive behavior. Neuronal connections are so addicted to the stimulus that the individual ceases to have voluntary control over his decisions. This is what he calls brain lock, where part of the mind watches powerless while the other gives in to the impulses. It is like living in two worlds at the same time, that of intention and that of compulsion. Jung already warned that what is not brought to consciousness manifests itself as destination. That is, if we do not become aware of these standards, they will control us, and we will still think it is unlucky, which is the world, which is just a relapse. Recognizing this cycle is the first step to break it. Because there is no addiction without repetition, and there is no repetition without an unconscious script from behind. For Carl Jung, the shadow is that part of our psyche that houses everything we repress: desires, trauma, impulses, fears, and also forgotten potentials. And that's exactly that addiction finds fertile ground, in what we hide, even from ourselves. Jung did not see the shadow like an evil in itself. The problem arises when it is ignored, and addiction is often the scream of the shadow asking for attention. Imagine someone who grew up listening that feeling angry is wrong, that cannot make mistakes, cannot fail, cannot show weakness. This person learns to suppress important parts of themselves. But what is repressed does not disappear, becomes symptoms. Addiction, in this case, may be the unconscious way of giving vent to these impulses that have been exiled from consciousness. The person does not understand the reason, but feels that he needs something to anesthetize the discomfort of being who is, or rather who can no longer be. Jung's proposal is not to eliminate the shadow, but to integrate it. Bring to light what was forgotten, because while the shadow commands in the dark, it rules life hard. But when illuminated, she can become a powerful ally on the healing journey. If you have gotten here, it is because this theme has touched something inside you, and maybe that is already the first step in a deep journey. The truth is that addiction, whether in substances or behaviors, is not about weakness. It is about unique pain. It is about the absence. It is about a silent cry by connection, meaning, and welcome. Jung shows us that only when we face the shadow, what we deny ourselves, is we able to integrate completely. Gabor Maté reminds us that the root of addiction is pain, and that healing begins with compassion, not judgment. The question that is for you now is, what have you used to anesthetize the pain? And what would happen if, for the first time, you look straight to her with courage and presence? If this video helped you reflect, share it with someone who also needs to hear it. Leave here in the comments. Which part has impacted you the most? Have you ever faced a vicious cycle? What was it like to get out of it, or how is it? We read everything and answer as much as possible. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and support us to continue bringing reflections that move with the soul. We see each other in the next episode of Your Inner Odyssey.